Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, A Worm Riding Clouds, Standards, Strategy, and Power in the Han Feizi. Imagine you're the minder of an important politician. Society is chaotic as states are constantly at war, with larger states opportunistically taking advantage of weakened, smaller states. People are anxious and terrified. Some are starving. If you lived in the late Warring States time, you wouldn't need to imagine this situation. What would you do about it? Well, the Wu thinkers, known to us as the Confucians, advised rulers to establish a way of virtue. This would be the Tao of a morally enlightened ruler who embodies benevolence and whose actions are ritually appropriate. As an exemplar, such a ruler would be a model for the people, showing them what it means to care for others as appropriate to his role. The Moists, instead, promoted the doctrine of inclusive care, and as for the Taoists, they wouldn't attempt to order the state by prescribed values, but instead create conditions for people to respond more spontaneously to circumstances. If you're skeptical that any of these strategies would have risen to the challenges of the time, then you might instead look to the three-pronged program proposed in the Han Feizi. It would not pursue the daunting ambition of making the people virtuous, instead focusing on a political infrastructure that can ensure their compliance. The ruler would also deploy strategies and institutions so as to have a hold over his advisors. The program is summed up in three words: Fa, or standards, which we're already familiar with, Shu, meaning strategy or technique, and Shi, power by virtue of one's position. These are the so-called three pillars of the Han Feizi, a hefty 55-chapter text that covers issues relating to state power and control, the nature of rulership, strategies both for regulating the behavior of the people and holding in check those involved in the state's administration. It draws on historical cases, parables, and analogies, often to criticize other approaches to governing the state. It is particularly critical of a Confucian approach to socio-political order for a number of reasons which we'll examine more closely in the coming episodes. The Han Feizi was offering something the other thinkers didn't. Rivals to legalism upheld the ways of sages and looked to antiquity for solutions. The Confucians anchored benevolence and rightness in the ways of the sages. Moists advocated the practices of sages that brought about beneficial outcomes, and Taoist sages went the opposite way, embracing an approach that refrained from imposing their visions on the people. Neither the Confucian nor Moist visions suffices, according to the Han Feizi. Advocating the ways of sages often meant relying on tradition, or prioritizing values established hundreds of years ago. In legalist eyes, this wasn't going to work, if only because times had changed. The state was now significantly more populous. As the Han Feizi says, in high antiquity, the people were few and wild beasts were many. During that time, sages were indispensable and personally involved in the development of human civilization. The passage continues, the people could not overcome the birds and beasts, the insects and the snakes. Then a sage appeared. He arranged pieces of wood to make nests so the people could find escape from all sorts of harm, and the people felt pleased with this, and set him to rule as king over the world. They gave him the byname Nest Builder. The people ate fruits, berries, mussels, and clams. These turned rank and putrid and gave off nasty smells that were harmful to people's stomachs, and the people were often sick. Then a sage appeared. He drilled firewood and brought forth fire in order to get rid of the rank and putrid, and the people felt pleased and set him to rule as king over the world. They gave him the name Fire Driller. The Han Feizi represents the sages in antiquity as all-purpose problem solvers. Given the small population, they could devote themselves in a hands-on way, which the text goes on to illustrate with examples from various historical periods. The overall point is that actions required at specific points in time are not necessarily appropriate in others. It's simplistic to assume that the measures suitable for one age also work well for another, and foolish to cling to the model offered by sages of antiquity. The Han Feizi instead promotes the new sages, leaders who are able to adapt to the times. If people praise the way of Yao, Shun, Tang, Wu, and Yu in our own time, then they will certainly be laughed at by the new sages. Thus, sages are not committed to cultivating antiquity, and do not take something constantly acceptable as their standard. They judge the current affairs of their age. and take the appropriate measures for them. The sage ruler, then, is no longer bound by the values, practices, and methods of the past. Instead, as Christoph Hobsmeyer puts it, the new sage is one who would replicate the success of the early thearchs and monarchs without modeling himself after them. This view contrasts sharply with the Confucian commitment to virtuous government and the Moist doctrine of inclusive concern, as both traditions viewed their own insights as timeless. In the case of the new sages, it seems, expediency takes precedence. This advice for rulers to keep up with the times might, however, seem well aligned with the theme of spontaneity in Taoist philosophy. As we mentioned, the Han Feizi, in fact, includes 2 chapters on the Lao Tzu, one entitled Explaining Lao Tzu, and the second Illustrating Lao Tzu. Here's an example of how a legalist thinker explains wu wei, non-action, as a characteristic of the legalist ruler, alluding to him as being like a mirror, which is also an image in the Shuangzi. The ruler is like a mirror, which merely reflects the light that comes to it, itself doing nothing, and yet because of its mere presence, beauty and ugliness present themselves to view. The ruler's method is that of complete acquiescence. He merges his personal concerns with the public good, so that as an individual he does not act. He does not act, yet as a result of his non-action, the world brings itself to a state of complete order. This description of the ruler's non-action, again, the Chinese is wu wei, could well have been lifted from the Lao Tzu. However, it is in fact from the writings associated with Shun Buhai. And indeed, as in Taoism, the legalist ruler does not impose his will on the people. However, the motivations for legalist wu wei are worlds apart from that of a Taoist sage. In the Shuangzi, the reason for the sages not imposing one standard for everyone is to make room for individuals to exercise initiative. In legalism, wu wei is instead a method for ensuring absolute control. Hardly a Taoist rationale, even if it's a paradox that a Taoist might enjoy. Perhaps because the Han Feizi doesn't ground itself in doctrine but draws ideas from different sources, the text contains differences in emphasis and even contradictions. That's par for the course with Warring States texts, but usually we explain inconsistencies with reference to authorship and compilation. Passages were not written with a book in mind, but rather they were collated, sometimes years later, and often named after a master. So we shouldn't be surprised to come across different views expressed within one text. With the Han Feizi, though, there's another reason why such problems arise. Paul Golden attributes them to the nature of the Han Feizi, whose views and arguments changed depending on the audience Han Fei was addressing. Han Fei's avowed opinion simply changes with his audience. Yuri Pines, another researcher in legalist philosophy, goes further still, questioning the very expectation of ideological integrity or ideological uniformity within a text. If we accept the view that Han Fei was focused on persuading different audiences, then the question of inconsistencies is no longer an urgent or even a relevant one. Another distinctive feature of the Han Feizi within the Warring States period is that Han Fei does seem to have been the author of several of the essays it contains. This makes it different from most other texts we've looked at so far, whose authorship is indeterminate. And this is a harbinger of what we'll see in the Han Dynasty, when questions of authorship will be less contentious and speculative. Also typical of Han literature is that discussions relate to real historical events. This too is something we find already in the Han Feizi. For example, we know that the powerful minister Li Si served the Qin state prior to the establishment of the Qin Unified Empire, and thereafter had a major role in shaping the empire's policies, and that he was driven by legalist ideas. This means we need to read the text differently from how we might read the Analects. All of which provides us with a context for understanding what the Han Feizi has to say about standards, strategy, and political power. Using standards to run the state is an effective tool of control, and Xiang Yang is said to be a major proponent of its use. Chapter 43 of the Han Feizi, entitled Determining Standards, talks about standards as an instrument to get people to toe the line. This aligns with the use of fa in Warring States discourse, referring primarily to standards for behavior. However, their implementation in the legalist approach to government is different. The Han Feizi discusses how Xiang Yang used fa in the sense of penal law to bring order to society. As for fa, this is that regulations and ordinances are recorded in the official archives, that punishments and fines appear inevitable into the minds of the people, and that rewards are in place for those who are cautious in regards to the laws, and that punishments are applied to those who offend against the ordinances. This is what the ministers take as their guiding authority. Here, as in another chapter entitled The Two Handles, standards are used to punish unruliness on the one hand and to reward endorsed behaviors on the other. In the Book of Lord Shan, the text associated with Shangyang, there's an argument for punishments to be heavy and rewards to be light. In this text, it seems that you can use punishments to compel the people to do just about anything. Use punishments to handle cowards, they will surely become brave. Use rewards to handle the brave, they will be ready to die. When cowards are brave and the brave are ready to die, the state will have no rivals and it will be strong. The instrument of fa, implemented as penal law, mostly applied to ordinary people and how they conducted themselves. But the ordinary people weren't the only ones who needed to be watched. The advisors to rulers were still more threatening, since they would have been handling complex matters relating to the state, and thus have a much greater capacity to challenge the ruler, perhaps even threaten his position. Even though penal law also applied to advisors, it was not sufficient to ensure that the ruler was safe from scheming advisors. The Han Feizi has a chapter entitled Ministers Who Betray, Coerce, or Assassinate Their Rulers, which says how important it is for rulers to have a strategy or technique, shu, to control their advisors. The Han Feizi attributes this second pillar to Shun Buhai, expressing the ruler's absolute power over his ministers. As for techniques, this is to bestow office on the basis of concrete responsibilities, to demand performance on the basis of titles, to wield the lever of life and death, and to examine the capacities of the ministers. These are the things the ruler of men is to hold on to. The ruler controls his officials by specifying what their responsibilities are. As bearers of titles, officials are held to account when they fail to perform their duties. The ultimate threat is death. Again, the idea of fulfilling one's responsibilities according to one's title or rank is not new. The Confucians, and in particular Xunzi, emphasize that bearers of particular titles, such as Junzi, an exemplary person, should conduct themselves as befits their name. This is the idea of zhenming, aligning conduct with name. The later Moists, too, were preoccupied with ensuring that names were used reliably to pick out the correct things and aspects of the world. The Han Feizi suggests that officials' positions should be specified or fixed in the titles they hold. The phrase it uses to describe this strategy of the ruler is xingming, which Harbsmeyer translates as job description. The ruler uses this system to determine and control his officials. He retains ministers according to performance and job descriptions and regulates them with standards and measures. These job descriptions are part of a ruler's technique in dealing with his officials. This sounds like an eminently reasonable policy that would be observed in any well-run business today, with the significant exception that here, a bad job evaluation could lead to death. The incompetent data analyst gets fired, but the advisor who gives poor advice to the ruler would be executed. This strategy of control should, however, remain a closely guarded secret, in striking contrast to the clarity with which penal law is publicized. For the ruler's position is a precarious one. He's dependent on his officials, and as soon as this is noticed, it will expose the ruler's weaknesses. The ruler must therefore control his advisors without letting them notice how they are being controlled. Though he is being systematic, to his ministers his behavior may seem arbitrary, and this will keep them on their toes at all times. This image of the ruler as a shadowy, unpredictable presence may be taken as an example of how the legalists have appropriated Taoist Wu Wei. In the quote we mentioned before from Shun Buhai on the ruler's acquiescence and his mirror-like qualities, Wu Wei takes on a darker intonation. The statement that he merely reflects the light that comes to it, itself doing nothing, and yet because of its mere presence, beauty and ugliness present themselves to view, may be understood as a technique devised to maintain a vice grip on the advisors. The third pillar, shu, refers to positional power, that is, the power a ruler has by virtue of his office. There was a long-standing belief in ancient China that people in positions of power bore significant responsibilities for the people. For instance, the Son of Heaven received the mandate of heaven, and with it the responsibility to see that it was realized in the human world. But the idea that this power belonged to a specific position or role was often simply assumed. The Han Feizi makes it explicit. In one passage, legalist positional power is contrasted with Confucian rule by virtue. The passage alludes to the ideal Confucian case, in which a morally worthy ruler influences those who are morally unworthy. In response, the Han Feizi claims that the ruler's virtue is insufficient for government. Instead, it is shu, positional power, that can anchor the government. The passage cites a section from fragments associated with Shun Dao, known as the Shunzi, which uses fanciful imagery. The winged snake travels on the mists, and the flying dragon rides the clouds. But when the clouds are gone and mists dissipate, then they become the same as worms, because they have lost that upon which they were riding. Therefore, if worthies yield to an unworthy, this is because their authority is too light. If unworthies submit to a worthy, it is because his status is respected. When the sage king Yao was a commoner, he could not bring order to neighboring families, while when the tyrant Jie was the son of heaven, he was able to bring disorder to all under heaven. Looking at it from this viewpoint, being worthy is not sufficient to make the masses bow down, but positional power and status are sufficient to make worthies bend. In other words, it is position that makes for an effective ruler, not vice or virtue. The Han Feizi then introduces an objector who is presumably of Confucian persuasion. This opponent challenges the view that positional power is sufficient for bringing about stability in the state. He argues that during the reign of tyrants like Jie and Zhou, positional power was not sufficient to prevent the turmoil they brought about in society. Even worse, here positional power supported their tyrannical rule. Han Fei says, to make an unworthy person ride on positional power, this is to give wings to a tiger. The Han Feizi agrees that the tyrannical rule of Jie and Zhou was undesirable and that Yao and Shun were worthy rulers. However, it then provides a pragmatic justification for positional power as the basis of government. Sages, such as Yao and Shun, and tyrants, such as Jie and Zhou, are exceptional. In fact, they come along only once in 1,000 generations. It makes no sense to build a political system around extraordinarily good men, nor to design the system to be invulnerable to the emergence of extraordinarily bad men. Rather, one should plan for the many generations when rulers are ordinary. Such rulers are, as the text puts it, not up to Yao and Shun at the top, nor as low as Jie and Zhou at the bottom. And here, the Han Feizi seems to have a point. The best way to ensure institutional stability across time is to be ready for the normal case, not the abnormal case, assuming, that is, that one cannot do both. The three instruments, penal law, strategy, and positional power, are woven together in the philosophy of the Han Feizi. Numerous chapters refer to strategy and argue that without it, neither penal law nor positional power are in themselves sufficient for rule. We need all three pillars. The Han Feizi's treatment of the three themes has led to a widely held view that Han Fei is the great synthesizer of legalism. This would make Han Feizi the most important text in Chinese legalist philosophy, with the three pillars as its core ideas. But without taking anything away from the Han Feizi, we should not allow it to overshadow the significant and nuanced ideas found in the Book of Lord Shang and in the fragments associated with Shen Buhai and Shun Dao. As Paul Golden has written, the tendency to extol Han Fei as the great synthesizer and focus on the Han Feizi at the expense of other ancient Chinese political philosophers can be traced to Han Fei's self-serving depiction of Shun Dao, Shen Buhai, and Gong Sung Yang as the authors of single political concepts, which only Han Fei himself combined into a coherent philosophy. Of course, if the Han Feizi really included all the worthwhile ideas from the earlier texts we classify as legalist, then we would not miss out on much by reading it and ignoring the others. But this turns out not to be the case. For example, the Book of Lord Shang is distinguished by its focus on the total reshaping of the state and its people. For him, control of the state means overseeing two things: military affairs and agriculture. And even agriculture is important because of its relation to warfare. After all, a strong army depends on full granaries. So here, we have a focus appropriate to a warring state's text. In keeping with this, Lord Shang speaks against merchants and artisans, deeming their activities as mere distractions. Still worse, merchants and artisans have the means to accumulate independent wealth and set themselves up as social elites. The state cannot tolerate such independence from the political machinery. The almost totalitarian tendency of this work can also be seen in its treatment of penal laws. These laws should be based on people's dispositions and accord with their customs. Together with strict enforcement, this will ensure that the people internalize the laws. We find something similar in the texts that convey Shun Dao's views. According to him, it is critical for the ruler to develop penal laws that are appropriate to his people. Shun Dao seems more aligned with Taoist thought, as he believes that rulers must grasp patterns in heaven's Tao in order to understand the dispositions of the people. The way of heaven is such that if you follow, then you will be great, while if you alter, then you will be insignificant. To follow means to follow the dispositions of the people. Among people, no one fails to act for himself. If you try to alter them and cause them to act for you, then there will be none whom you can secure and employ. Rulers must ensure that the people do not resent having to conform to penal law. The role of the ruler in this regard is more like an orchestrator, who ensures that Fa is implemented in a way that incentivizes the people. This gives us a rather nuanced view of penal law, one at odds with the cliched picture of the legalist ruler as a tyrant who simply uses threats to keep his people in line. In fact, you could argue that legalist philosophy is not so much about keeping the people in line as about keeping the ruler in line. One view held consistently across all these texts is that rulers can be quite mediocre. In fact, they usually are. These average men will need help from institutional forms of support, which is exactly what is provided by the three pillars of the Han Feizi. The man who would be a worm if left to his own devices can be more like a dragon once he perches on the mists and clouds. The Xunzi puts the point very frankly: the wisdom of the Lord is not necessarily the greatest among the people. As Yuri Pines explains, the solution to this inherent problem of rulership was to reduce the ruler's personal intervention into policymaking to the degree of almost complete nullification of the ruler's personality. If Han Fei accepts the Taoist idea of non-action, it is because he expects the ruler to be a non-entity. One can hardly imagine a starker contrast with Confucianism and its stress on the personal virtue of the ideal sage king. According to the legalists, such a man is unfortunately as rare as a steak that hasn't even left the freezer. And that's only one point that the legalists used in their beef with the Confucians. We'll meet with more of them next time here on the History of Philosophy in China.